Welcome to How Do They Afford That, the podcast that peeks into the financial lives of everyday Australians. I'm Michael Thompson. I'm a writer and co-host of Fear and Greed, the business podcast. And as always, I'm with Canna Campbell, financial planner and founder of Sugar Mama TV, the financial literacy platform on podcasts like this one, YouTube and Instagram and books and more. Hi, Canna.
Good morning, Michael. I'm so excited about this episode because we're talking about a tree change. Or a sea change. Yeah,
a sea change as well. And look, this is something a little bit different because I reckon this is something that a lot of people have weighed up. They might not necessarily have be kind of seriously considered it, but you show me anyone who hasn't just thought, you know what, maybe we should just move to the country. Maybe we should move out of the city and go and kind of get a bigger place with a bigger backyard and imagine the lifestyle that we'll have. It's not as simple as that. And you kind of hear some horror stories and you hear some fantastic stories of successes, but there's a lot of things you should consider. So today I wanted to kind of almost do a bit of a role play with you. That sounds kind of risky, actually. We were going to go through the things that you need to think about before you make a tree change. Have you ever thought of it?
No. No, that sounds so narrow-minded.
Just after I've said everyone's considered it, I ask you, have you ever done it? No.
I am a massive homebody, and I love where we live, and I feel very lucky, so no. But on the other hand, Tom, my wild, crazy partner, wants a tree or a sea change every other day. He literally changes his mind like he changes his underpants. Like one day he wants to move to New Zealand, the next day he wants to move to France, and then the following day he wants to move back to his home, which is Barraba, regional New South Wales. So,
well, I mean, he is, as we've discussed previously, an equine physio. So he kind of massages horses.
Yes, like he does acupuncture, and it's actually
really?
it's a very defined skill set.
Horse acupuncture.
Oh, yeah, he was Winx's physio.
Really?
Yeah, all the top race horses he looks after.
That is
he's
so
really
cool.
And he's very passionate about equine welfare.
And does that mean then that if you were to consider a tree change or a sea change, you just got to go somewhere where there is a thriving equine industry, plenty of horses?
Look, I think at the top of Tom's list is somewhere in France because he speaks French, and there is, obviously there's lots of horses in France that he can, treat, and he would love to do that. But there's a lot to be considered before, like Tom jumps in head first, whereas I'm heels digging.
Are you saying that you're fairly considered and you take a considered approach to most things? Because this will come as a big surprise.
In this area, yes, because I'm such a homebody. I'm such a dork. I love just my house and just staying there and not leaving.
I'm not surprised by this.
Really?
Yeah. No. Because, I mean, you are very careful in your approach to kind of money and everything, and it doesn't surprise me that you would go, you know what? I have budgeted for this lifestyle, and this is how I want it to continue.
Thank you for making me feel understood.
That's what I'm here for. Look, we've considered it. We've talked about it a lot, moving to kind of regional areas. And part of the benefit is the fact that you can do a lot of jobs remotely. And this, I mean, we are, 1.5 meters apart in the studio at the moment. We could theoretically be hundreds of kilometres apart and we would still be able to do this. But there's this risk, isn't there, that the whole grass is always greener kind of principle. And then you get there and it's not. So let's kind of pick through let's look at the advantages first. Let's actually do the positive kind of things. Affordability.
Yeah, being able to, your dollar stretches a lot further when you go outside of the major cities.
And so why is that? Is it kind of real estate being real estate has obviously boomed everywhere over the last kind of few years, a bit of a correction, but then kind of an uptick again. And regional areas saw that as well, particularly during COVID when there was a lot of people kind of moving out of the cities into these regional areas. Is it kind of real estate where you kind of see the biggest difference in terms of the bang for your buck?
Look, it depends on what areas you're looking at and the timing, because obviously some areas have boomed and some have come back a bit, whereas some have held their value. But, it's the basic, economics behind the supply and demand. And you've got, more land, you've got more space, you've got potentially more supply. all those sort of variables come into it. One of the main reasons why it's so much more affordable.
And the other kind of things, the general kind of cost of living, what does this include? Because it's one of these preconceptions that everyone assumes that you move to the country, move to a regional area, and the cost of living is cheaper. Why? I'm just trying to get an understanding of why that would be. Is it kind of insurance and food?
Look, not necessarily, and this is why I think people make these massive assumptions. Like one of my best friends moved to, packed up and sold their house in a very lovely area and moved to a regional town. And she said to me it wasn't quite as cheap as they thought because they're now spending so much more money on petrol. It's not like a quick walk down the road to grab a pint of milk. It's getting in the car and, a certain amount of money in petrol. And sometimes those products are actually more expensive because they've got to factor in the transportation. So it's not quite as simplistic as getting out of town and it's going to be cheaper necessarily. But then also there are people who've moved to regional areas and live off the grid. So, for example, I look at my in-laws and they barely go to the supermarket because they grow all their vegetables at home.
Wow.
Yeah, and they've got solar power and, they're really clever at what they've built at home. So their cost of living is substantially lower than someone like their next door neighbour, for example.
And what about then insurance? I'm assuming.
Again, see, this is the thing. If you buy a home that's in a high risk area for bushfire
or floods,
your insurance premiums may go up. So you can't be like Tom and dive in head first. You do need to really get a detailed understanding of what you're up for and is the savings really there. And the one thing I would say to anyone who's thinking of doing this is you've got to speak to your employer as well. Are they going to allow you to work remotely? Or is there an expectation that you can do 2 days remote, 3 days in the office? And under what terms and conditions will they contribute towards your accommodation? If you do have to stay in town for a work event or whatever it may be, you need to look at all the fine details as to how this is going to work and what the true cost is.
I'd love to hear some kind of success stories of this and maybe some people can reach out to us on social media and let us know if they did make the change, make the move and kind of some of the things that they noticed were cheaper or were potentially more expensive if they made a tree change or a sea change. We'll come back in a second because I want to talk to you about some of the other considerations, some of the cons, I suppose. It feels like we've covered off a lot of cons.
I feel like it was negative Nelly and me is really like...
you are being very negative on this, and I feel like you're crushing my dreams a little bit.
Sorry.
That's all right. After I
Not really.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll come back in a moment and can crush some more. Canna, we're talking about making a tree change or a sea change, and which is obviously nothing kind of new. People have been moving out of the city for regional areas forever, but it has had this boom in recent years, fueled partly by kind of COVID lockdowns, and then importantly, the shift towards remote working. And the communications technology has just opened that up entirely, where it's not necessarily a case anymore of if you wanted to do a sea change or a tree change, you would essentially have to quit your job and go and find a new job. Maybe the same industry, but you would need to do it. No, there are a lot of people kind of still doing their old jobs remotely. You mentioned before the break the conversation that you need to have with your boss.
Yes.
How does that go?
Knock, knock.
Okay, from the start. Come in. You look like you have an important question to ask.
Look, employers are really open to staff working remotely, and obviously it cuts down their costs because they don't have to have as many desks. They can downsize the office. There are lots of benefits to it. So more and more employers are open to these conversations, but then there needs to be a contract that says, okay, well, if you're going to work remotely, these are the expectations, and if we need you in town, you must make yourself available. And if you do, we'll pay for your airfares or your transportation or your accommodation or dinner money or whatever it may be. Because I had an example where a friend of mine moved into a regional area and then something happened and they had to come back to Sydney and they had to pay, I think, 4 nights accommodation in a hotel. And these things do eat into, the actual financial benefits of moving to a regional area.
And would it be as serious as that in terms of kind of formalizing it in an agreement with your employer potentially?
I think most definitely, because if it's all just a gentleman's agreement, if something goes wrong, you need to be able to refer to a contract that says, hang on, we agreed on these terms and conditions with myself working remotely. And you want to obviously protect yourself, because you would hate for someone to, you move remotely, your employer, have a gentleman's agreement about how this will be handled, and then all of a sudden you lose your job because you're not in the office as much as what you were supposed to be. And now you're stuck living remotely and you don't have an income stream anymore. So play devil's advocate here and sleep well at night by having everything documented correctly.
Goodness me. I'm
sounding like a lawyer now.
No, it's good. It's actually quite practical, I think, because I would be kind of attracted by this is going to make me sound really bad, but I mean, social media, for instance, tends to show a very, very positive side
of everything. Not just
and it's not just that, but I suppose that you risk having quite an idealistic view of what it's like. That it is going to be kind of the kids riding their bikes around town and kind of walking themselves to school, and everybody knowing each other, and just this ideal life. And it's not necessarily that you need to be aware that those are kind of the highlights, the best parts. But it's not a holiday. You still have to work. The kids still have to go to school. You still got to do the grocery shopping and the mowing and the ironing and all those things. And maybe that's why we're seeing now, there was some recent data out that showed that there are a lot of people still moving from metropolitan areas into the country, but there's actually a lot of people now moving back as well. And that came out probably 6 weeks or so ago, showing that the mobility of the population has actually increased dramatically. That a lot of people moving one way, plenty of people moving back. So maybe it's a case that they're kind of not getting cold feet, I suppose, but maybe that they found that the grass isn't quite as green as they thought it was going to be. Can I ask you about trying before you buy? Is that kind of an idea that you would do here? So say you had your eye on a particular kind of regional area. Would you kind of rent in a town for 6 months or 12 months before you go all in and buy a place?
Absolutely. I think renting before you commit to buying in that area, because obviously it's expensive to buy, particularly with stamp duty, is a fantastic idea. But make sure you use that time whilst you're renting to do your research and get a really good feel for your area and if it's right for you. And even simple things like, how close do I want to be to the supermarket or a hospital? And what schools are in my catchment? So, for example, I had some clients who moved to a regional area and they rented, and it actually was the best thing for them because they got to understand the different schools, and they realized that the area that they initially thought they wanted to buy into didn't have a particularly good public school system. And because it's a catchment system, it would mean that their kids were going to have to go to this school. So by doing their research, knowing the market, they were able to look at what was potentially a better area to move into and ultimately buy, which would get them into a different catchment for a better public school. So all these little things really do count. And it also gives you a good idea as to, or a good feel for what the market's doing, what's a good buy, what's not, what's a good street, what's a better street, what do we need as a house? Do we need a 3-bedroom house or do we need a 4-bedroom house? Do we want a pool or do we want a garage? All these little things you can get a greater feel if you use that time whilst renting, and of course, ideally saving and fattening up your deposit as much as possible so that your mortgage isn't as stressful, are things that you can use that renting period for.
And that would be more than just like 2 weeks. Like it feels like it's got to be a time where you really get a feel for it.
Yes. And you know what? Pick up the phone and call the local real estate agents. Ask them, what's the market looking like? You know, what sells quickly? What do you think is good value right now? If we were to ever move out of town, is what would be potentially something to buy now as a principal place of residence, and then we could potentially flick it to an investment property if we were move back to the city again.
That's an idea, isn't it? Because we've talked in the past about rent vesting.
Yeah.
And renting where you want to live and buying where you can afford. That's right, isn't it? Yes.
Yes, yeah.
And so I suppose there would be a way that you could do this. Say you were to own a place in a city, that essentially you could use that as an investment property, flick
Yep.
it to an investment property for a year or 2 years while you're kind of off experimenting with the country lifestyle, and rent in the town that you're moving to. And in doing so, you are kind of getting a feel for it, but you haven't just entirely uprooted your entire life. You've done a fair amount of uprooting, but you haven't kind of just cut off all ties just in case everything does go wrong.
Exactly. And there's actually two parts to what I'm suggesting here. So first of all, if you were to rent, say, your city dwelling out and you go and rent somewhere else, you actually would fall into this is a 6 months like tax loophole where any capital growth you get to keep whilst your property is being rented out up to 6 years, assuming you don't go and buy another property yet. So say, for example, I was to rent my house in Sydney and go and rent in a regional town. For the up to 6 years, any capital growth on my property remains tax-free, even if I go to sell. As long as I'm still renting, I haven't bought anything else. Okay, so that's really a great loophole that you want to talk to your accountant about to make sure you qualify. And there are obviously the fine details and terms and conditions to qualify for that. But what I'm actually suggesting here as well is if you move to a regional town, you buy a home, but you know that there isn't a chance in 5 years or whatever many years, you may have to move back to the city for your next career opportunity, that you can potentially flick that property that you had previously bought and living in as now an investment property and as a form of passive income. So, you know, it works both ways.
Okay. One final question, I suppose, before we wrap things up. Is this one of those kind of major life events? Because I actually got a lecture once from my accountant. I seem to attract kind of lectures on various topics. And the point was, you need to be having these conversations with financial advisors and with your accountants anytime there is a major life event. And this would be one. So say you lose your job, or say you change jobs, or say you want to buy a house, or you decide to have kids or have another kid, or one person returns to the workforce, or you decide you're going to move from the city to a regional area. It's one of those triggers. That's one of those major life events, he called it. And you need to have a conversation then, because there are things that you may not have thought of. Exactly.
And they can go through all the pros and cons and help make sure that you make an educated, informed decision.
Okay. All right. Quick summary, because there's a few kind of bits and pieces in this. And we're not just talking kind of tree changes, it's also sea changes. It's basically any relocation where you are kind of perhaps chasing a different lifestyle. There are kind of things to consider. That the advantage is obviously kind of perhaps potentially a slower pace of life, maybe away from the rat race kind of thing. Affordable living in some cases, that it might be more affordable through real estate. You might be able to get cheaper rent, or a bigger house, more bedrooms, bigger backyard than you might have been able to afford in a city. But that is potentially offset by, you'll spend more on fuel, for instance. You might have a longer kind of drive kind of between various places because everything is just a bit more spread out. While the general cost of living is kind of seen as often being cheaper, it's not necessarily the case, because food inflation, for instance, has kind of affected everything everywhere. It's not as though you're kind of moving back in time when you move to a different place. You are still kind of moving, and everyone's still subject to a lot of the same economic pressures. The things you need to really assess include kind of the schools, the health facilities that are available to you. And one option is potentially to try before you buy, in terms of renting for 6 months or 12 months. And while you're there, as you said, Canna, do your research. Use that as the time to really have a good look around and assess whether this is going to be right for you, and whether you are actually going to see any savings, or whether they're just going to be offset. And one of those things that could potentially kind of eat into the savings, as you said, is if you have to keep coming back to the city for work, and if you have to keep wearing the cost of that. And so you need to have that conversation early with your employer, figure out what the options are and how much you can work remotely, how much you need to kind of be coming back for, who covers the cost, and if you can, get it in an agreement and get it actually written down, so that if there's any disputes in the future, you can just point to that piece of paper and says who's supposed to be bearing the cost of it. And have a conversation, funnily enough, ending with this point, have a conversation with your financial planner or your accountant about some of the things that you may not have considered in terms of the use of your property while you're away, what you're going to do long-term potentially in terms of investment properties. Did I miss anything?
I think you have summed that up perfectly.
I'm getting quite good at these summaries.
I think I would never be able to do the summaries. So I like how you do it because I just sit back and relax.
I just take lots of notes. And sometimes the notes are not related at all to the episode, and they're the real stitch-ups where all of a sudden I get to the end of it and all I've just done is like doodle the entire time. For instance, one of the notes I took this time was pint of milk, because I found it amusing that you referred to it as a pint of milk instead of going, yeah.
And pint's like American, isn't it?
Very British, isn't it?
Well, I was born in London and I grew up in England, so there you go.
Claim it. That's where a little bit of your childhood has just kind of popped up right at the end of the show. All right. If anyone wants more information from you, Canna, where can they find you?
The best place is probably Instagram at SugarMamaTV, because I provide you with all the links the moment my content goes live. And I also provide you with some fun content along the way on that platform. Otherwise, make sure you are following and subscribed to my podcast, Sugar Mama's Fireplay, which goes off every Monday morning. And I share inspiring, empowering stories from everyday people who've achieved great things financially, as well as obviously a range of comprehensive financial strategies to help you get ahead financially.
And you can hear me every day with Sean Aylmer on Fear and Greed, which is Australia's most popular business podcast. And you can also buy my novel, How to Be Remembered, basically anywhere you buy books. Thank you very much for listening to How Do They Afford That? Remember to hit follow on the podcast and please leave us a review too. Next week, we are going to talk about buying big things. Basically, kind of next time you need to buy a TV or a fridge or an oven or anything like that. I'm really kind of just naming all household things there, but it could be anything. Some of the things that you need to consider, different ways that you could buy it, different kind of ways to maybe get it a little bit cheaper. Hopefully some good tips and some ideas that might save you a bit of cash. It should be a good one. Don't miss it.